Happy Leap Day and welcome to the Saints Insider Podcast. It's February 29th. It's a Thursday. It's an extra day in your football offseason, an extra day we got to wait for the draft and the football season and all that. So, guys, we thought we'd get together, even though Matt and Luke are in Indianapolis, and give you an extra podcast.
I like it.
So here we are on the Saints Insider, and in exchange, we need you to subscribe to our Saints on NOLA.com YouTube channel. Follow the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if that's how you listen, and give us a thumbs up. So appreciate you being here. I'm Zach Ewing. That's Rod Walker and Jeff Duncan. As mentioned, our intrepid beat writers are in Indianapolis for the NFL Scouting Combine, which we'll have a little recap of and kind of what we learned. We'll do that next week. But for today, something a little bit different. We want to rank the Saints' best off seasons in the Jeff Duncan era, which is entering its 25th season.
I have my own era. I like it.
Yeah. Well, you kind of invented this.
25 years. This is about 25th season.
Your 25th season. So the idea being that that one good offseason, Rod, can really change the fortunes of a franchise, and that's really kind of what the Saints need this year.
Yeah, I mean, you saw it last season with the Texans, I guess would be a good example. That's a team that had a good offseason. They were not very good, and all of a sudden they were good. So you can turn things around in the NFL. I mean, that's just kind of how the league works. So, if the Saints catch some breaks in free agency in the draft, we'll see what Clint Kubiak does. Maybe this is the year that they turn things around.
Yeah, Saints weren't that far off from being a good team. I mean, they lost some games that we all thought they should have won, and they could. You turn a couple of those around, all of a sudden you were 11-6 and one of the better teams in the NFC. So it can happen. Little housekeeping, some news and notes before we get going with that. Number one is the Saints restructured Cam Jordan's contract this morning, cleared a little more cap room. They're kind of continuing that process. I think they're under $30 million now over the cap. Now it gets a little bit difficult, though, Dunk. They got, now you got to talk about, are you going to trade Marshon Lattimore? Are you going to do something with Alvin Kamara? I mean, now the decisions get a little tougher. Or
maybe talk to some guys about taking pay cuts. That's always the difficult conversation they might have to have with a few guys. But they're going to get there. They have to get there. That's why I'm probably in the minority here. I'm not a big cap guy because every year you have to get there. So they'd be fined by the NFL. You have to be cap compliant. So they're going to find a way to get there. Now, obviously, there's consequences to that. How they get there makes it up.
Sure.
But we know they're going to do it. They're going to move money into signing bonuses, give players cash up front. And I think the secret to this whole process that the Saints have mastered is the fact that they have the cash to do this. A lot of teams don't, especially a lot of small market teams, and even the New Orleans Saints back in the day when Randy Mueller was the general manager, he used to tell me they didn't have a lot of cash on hand to give players money up front. Now they do, and I think that's partly due to the escalating revenue that the teams get. $400 million each team gets from the media rights deal. And then also I think the Saints deal with the state of Louisiana is so lucrative for them, they're able to have cash flow to where they can go to Cam Jordan and say, look, instead of you waiting to get your money and your salary during the course of the season, 18 game checks, we'll give it to you up front. Everybody wants money on hand. They can make more money with it. So this is a secret, I think, ingredient to the Saints' ability to work the margins and to apply their cap management the way they do. A lot of teams can't do it because they just simply don't have the money on hand to move all this money up front and pay players. So anyway, long rambling answer to, yeah, they got a lot of work to do. I have no doubt Mickey and Kai will get it done.
Yeah, and actually, because you have a year where the salary cap grew by more than anybody expected. I mean, everybody always says, oh, how are the Saints going to do this? They can't keep kicking the can down the road. Well, yeah, they can. It's a choice to do that, but they've obviously decided that that's how they want to do it. And now, Rod, we could be in a situation where because the cap grew by more than they expected, if they do get aggressive, they could actually then have some money to spend in free agency. Not a ton, but a little bit.
Yeah, I think they're obviously in a better situation, I would say, this year than they have been in the past just because of how much the salary cap, increased this season. So, we'll see if they're able to get some guys in free agency that normally that they wouldn't have been able to get this time a year ago.
Yeah. One more thing I want to get to before we go into kind of our offseason, the golden offseason talk, and that is the NFLPA released its annual survey from players yesterday. And Saints kind of got very middling grade. I think they were 19th out of 32 teams. Last year they were 10th or 11th, so they dropped. They got 2 Fs, or they got an F and a D. Yeah, the F was in food/cafeteria, which they are renovating the cafeteria, so that they're actively trying to fix that part of it. And then the other one, which I was surprised by, because I think last year they got like a B+. They got one of the better grades, was the treatment of families, which I think of your Saints ownership, Saints brass, you have to look at that and be a little concerned by that grade.
Yeah, and that D+, I looked at that, what was it called? Family
treatment of families, I think.
They got a D in it, but they ranked 20th in the league. So, I mean, that's clearly something that the entire league must be having problems with it. If you're 20th with a D, that says a lot about how
12 teams were worse than your D+.
Worse than your D+, yeah. So, I mean, that was a surprise. But, going back to the cafeteria, I know they're renovating the cafeteria, but when you read their report, some of the things they weren't really talking about the facilities itself. They were talking about the quality of the food, which was, a city like New Orleans, you don't expect the quality of the food to be bad. I mean,
they're feeding them press box food or what?
That's what this city is known for. So that was a bit of surprise. But I mean, Jeff and I, we've all been in press boxes, and we've seen some food that's been better than what we have here in New Orleans. So I mean, it's just kind of surprising that this city doesn't take advantage of what it's known for.
Yeah, why didn't the Pro Football Writers do a survey like this? We can grade press box food.
I thought about tweeting that out, actually, that exact thing, because I do think it's similar in a way.
Yeah, right.
It kind of levels the playing field, and it's all relative, right? I mean, I've been to the Saints cafeteria a bunch of times through different vendors they've had there. I think the food's really good, but this is NFL players we're talking about. I mean, these guys are used to very high standards of food, and I think there's a little bit of a misconception out there. Fans are thinking, this isn't Commander's Palace we're talking about. We're talking about NFL athletes that want healthy options. And I think the Saints have a lot of healthy options in the cafeteria. The problem is I think it's limited. There's not as many as some of the other. Whereas if a player, say like Tyrann Mathieu, played in a number of organizations, so he's seen a bunch of these training tables. And I think the problem is with the Saints, from what I understand, is there's just not as many options. So the food's healthy. It's good for them, but they would just like everybody. Everybody wants their own kind of food, and I don't think there's quite as many options. I think that's going to be alleviated when the new cafeteria, because they're restricted. This is the same cafeteria that they've had since they built it. So it's the organization's outgrown the cafeteria. They don't have the room to expand the food options. They're going to take care of that. And the other thing I heard from talking to people out on Airline Drive is that, one of the complaints from some of the players is that they don't have 3 meals a day. Well, they did at one time. They had 3 meals a day, but they found, and Rod, we see this. The Saints a lot of the players eat late, their lunch. They'll be in the locker room a lot of times, just coming from the cafeteria or in that open locker room period, which is usually around like 2 o'clock, 1:45, somewhere in that area. They'll be eating their lunch late. So when they're done with the meetings or when they're done, they're kind of out of there. They're not really around. Some guys are, though. That's the problem, is they want the option to have the dinner. Well, they don't offer that because they found that it's cost prohibitive. They're having an entire cafeteria staff there, chefs, cooking all this food. And
throw a bunch of food away.
For 4 or 5 players that do stay. So those are the ones probably complaining. So I get both sides of it. I understand it. But like if players, not enough of them are saying this is apparently just during the season that this is a problem. So, I mean, obviously they're not having 3 meals a day now because all the staff that eats in the cafeteria, they're leaving at 5. So I think a lot of these things are a little overblown. And the way I look at these surveys is if you're winning, you're probably not going to get as many negative marks. Winning tends to cure all. So I think if the Saints win next year, the grades will go up.
The Saints are one of 2 teams, by the way, that don't feed their teams 3 times a day. I don't know who the other team was, but you mentioned winning, but I was looking at that ownership. The Kansas City Chiefs had the worst ownership.
I know,
which
it's
was
amazing.
So
the Hunt
weird
family.
This is a team that
they won a Super
3 Super Bowls
2 back to back. Yeah, no, and I also think like a little bit of like there's obviously some questions with Dennis Allen. I mean, he got pretty low grade. His grade wasn't that bad, but his ranking was bad. Like
that's
29.
right where I was going next. I think it was a B plus, but it was
minus,
like,
maybe?
it was some
B
sort of a
minus.
B, but it was like 28th of the 32 coaches. It was very low.
Right.
which, number one, tells you most NFL players respect their coach and like their coach. Number two, I think it probably says even though Dennis Allen maybe doesn't have the respect of the other coaches, it's not a disaster. It's not like he got a D and the players hate him and he can't get the job done here.
Yeah. You have to wonder, like, if you're filling out a survey like that, though, I mean, I know it's confidential, but I think players probably are a little concerned about giving your coach an F and it getting out. I mean,
exactly.
in this day and age,
I would be.
I mean, you just, yeah.
Or if the whole locker room does that and then he blows up at the locker room and says, "What? You guys gave me a D," you know.
And look, I think, I mean, Rod might have a different opinion, but like talking to players, like I think most of them like Dennis Allen, and I think most of them respect him. But, you know, we're talking about the highest level of competition. Dennis Allen's being measured against a guy that's probably going to go with the Hall of Fame, and Sean Payton. So, and a lot of players in that locker room played for Sean Payton. So I think there's probably, you know, a little bit of a comparison there with a lot of guys. And so it might be unfair to some degree. And if this team were winning more, maybe they'd have a higher grade. I do think there's probably a little bit of a, you know, from what you understand, some of the complaints are accountability, attention to detail, some of the things we've written about in the culture issues. So I don't think you can ignore the results there, but I do think you have to take some of it with a grain of salt, and that the team has struggled, has made the playoffs, so guys are going to probably be a little disappointed with and point to the head coach.
But he was compared to Chuck Noll and Bill Walsh about a month ago. So.
That's true.
Next coming of Lombardi, baby. Okay. With that as the backdrop, let's talk about the offseason the Saints need to have, that they want to have, that they can have, and that they've shown in the past 4 times specifically that they can turn this franchise around and do what's needed in an offseason. First, I want to let you know you're watching the Saints Insider podcast. Subscribe to the Saints on NOLA.com YouTube channel. Hit the thumbs up button for us. Let's try to get to 100 likes on this video. We've gotten close a couple times the last couple of weeks. Let's try to get to 100. So hit that like button if you haven't already. Jeff, you wrote a column. It published on NOLA.com this morning. I put the link in the description of the episode. The idea behind this was, hey, as dreary as things look, as bleak as things look for the Saints as a whole, if they nail this offseason, and I think we'd probably say they're off to a decent start. Got good salary cap news, hired a big-name offensive coordinator. If they nail this offseason, they can turn this around in a hurry and pretty dramatically.
Yeah, I think the NFL business model facilitates that because, you know, it's so driven to make everything kind of a level playing field for everybody in the league, so parity-driven that, like Rod said, I mean, Houston Texans at this time a year ago, they just hired DeMeco Ryans. Probably nobody knew who Bobby Slowick is. They hadn't drafted C.J. Stroud and Will Anderson, so it looked pretty bleak there. You hope for a new coach, but certainly no one. I guarantee you, every Saints fan, like or journalist like myself, looked at the schedule when it came out and said, "Well, the Texans game, that's a win for the Saints." And here we are a year later. They were one of the final 8 teams in the league, and you got the offensive rookie of the year, the defensive rookie of the year, and this brilliant young head coach. You feel really good. A year later, I guarantee you people didn't feel that way in Houston. So it can turn around quickly. I think a little bit, you mentioned how the Saints had a lot of close losses this past year. I think back, I was doing some research the other day about the Super Bowl team. And, you know, in 2008, the team was 500 the year before. They lost a lot of games where they had the lead and couldn't finish the game with the defense. And then Sean Payton went in, fired Gary Gibbs, which is a very difficult decision for him because Gary Gibbs was the first coach to come with him when he took on the job here in New Orleans. The first member of his staff came with him from Dallas, was on the flight with him to New Orleans, and had to fire him and change out and get Greg Williams in there. They totally rebuilt their secondary, brought in Darren Sharper and Jabari Greer in free agency, and then they drafted Malcolm Jenkins, who was the consensus #1 defensive back in that draft, and he fell to them. And they immediately had 3 new starters in the secondary, a totally different scheme on defense. And all those games they were losing the year before, I mean, the rest is history. They won the Super Bowl. They won their first 13 games.
You're jumping the gun here on our rankings. You're giving away one of the top 4. That's okay. Well, that's a little foreshadowing.
Well, what I mean, though, is it can happen.
Yeah.
You know, you're not that far away.
Sure.
And the Saints, it's not like we're talking about 3-13, but they've done that before too.
Yeah.
And especially in the NFC. I mean, I think in the NFC, I think the AFC is a lot tougher when you look at all the great quarterbacks on that side. But I think in the NFC, I mean, the Saints are really right there. I mean, yeah, they played against some bad teams this season and lost some games, but I think when you look at the conference, I mean, I think there is room that this team could definitely jump up and be right in the mix. I think they're that close. Yeah.
49ers, Cowboys, maybe the Eagles, although they struggled at the end of last year.
I put Detroit.
The Lions, but that second tier where you're talking maybe the Rams, the Packers, Vikings. I mean, like the Saints could fit right in that. Yeah. The Falcons could too, I think.
It's pretty optimistic. I saw them play the Rams. They weren't very competitive in that game.
No, but that's why they need to get better in the offseason. So, all right. So, Jeff, what you did is you picked out 4 from your 25 years with the team and kind of ranked them. And number 4, coming in at number 4, and this shows you how many good off seasons the Saints have had in a, 25 years is a long time, but relatively speaking, if you're picking out 4 really good ones, that means you hit 1 out of every about 6. And if you go by that math, they're due for another one. It was 2017, okay? And most of what 2017, the offseason there, well, they didn't make a ton of changes, but they hit one of the great draft classes in modern NFL history. Marshon Lattimore, Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, Ryan Ramczyk, Trey Hendrickson.
Not Michael
Thomas. Marcus Williams.
Marcus Williams, I'm sorry. I think we have our graphic wrong, too. Also, Taysom Hill was an undrafted. They got him from the Packers that same year. So all these guys came in as rookies. And, I don't know, for those who don't follow the NFL religiously, like how rare it is 7 years later for all of these players to still be relevant, and many of them with this same franchise, just speaks to really how great that draft class was.
Yeah, and I think they got like 4 starters, immediate starters out of it. And, of course, Lattimore and Kamara were rookies of the year on offense and defense. And that team was very similar to the 08-09 transformation in that they weren't that far away. I mean, they won 7 games the year before, so it didn't take a whole lot. Just some playmaking ability. What I remember on those teams, 14, 15, 16, was that they lacked some playmaking ability. That Super Bowl core had gotten kind of old. They were transitioning away from some of those guys, and they needed playmakers. And all of a sudden you get Kamara and Lattimore, and they'd never had a corner like Marshon Lattimore. That has always been the weakness. Never had a shutdown corner, and he immediately stepped in. I think he had 5 picks his rookie year and just became that dude right away, and everything got transformed with that team.
I want to say, though, I believe they started 0-2 that year. They lost to the Vikings on a Monday night game to start the season, and then I can't remember who they played, and they went to London and shut out the Dolphins for their first win. And, Rod, you weren't covering the team full-time at that point, but, it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that this was that was the year I moved to Louisiana, and by week 6, week 7, week 8, you're going, man, this team is legitimately a Super Bowl contender.
Yeah, I mean, you think about when that season started, you had the running backs from Mark Ingram, Adrian Peterson, and Kamara. We didn't really know how good Kamara was going to be. But I mean, in training camp, I remember we saw some stuff and it was like, oh, this guy might be special, and it turned out that he was. But yeah, that team really kind of just gave the city, I think, some hope again, because I mean, things had kind of, tailed off a little bit, and they were able to do something with that draft class. And I mean, you go all the way to the 6th round of that class. That was Al-Qadim Muhammad, who didn't do much here, but I mean, he was on the Colts practice squad last year. So everybody they drafted in that class stuck in the NFL, that hardly ever happens.
Yeah, it's 7 years. 7 years is an eternity in the NFL. All of those guys are still around. So yeah, they had kind of stagnated in the Peyton Breeze era, 3 straight 7-9 seasons, got them back. So that's number 4. Number 3, this is the one, Jeff, you teased, 2009. Took a good team. Peyton and Breeze had established a good team here in 06 and 07. Like you mentioned, fell off, a lot of close losses in 08. Needed to revamp the defense specifically, and everything they did that offseason was geared toward that.
Yeah, and I think getting Greg Williams, who changed the mindset. The thing I remember when they got Williams in there was, he came in fire and brimstone, and the Saints had been, under Gary Gibbs, kind of a read and react defense. They were sound, but they weren't aggressive. They kind of just played to the weaknesses of the opposing offense. Greg Williams flipped that, and I think they found kind of the counter ego to Sean Payton on the defensive side of the ball. And so those offseason workouts, when you go to those practices, Greg Williams had that defense spitting fire, and they were not backing down from the Saints offense. So Drew Brees was being challenged. I mean, these guys were talking trash, and it just fed into this kind of change of culture on the defensive side of the ball, and that took the organization to a completely different level. They had two aggressive leaders. I mean, Greg Williams was kind of the head coach of the defense, and the players were, defensive players want to attack, and they found somebody that put them in position, kind of freed them up to play at this aggressive, kind of style, and they took the lead by storm. I mean, I was just going back through reading through that Super Bowl season. I mean, how far we've gone from that. Their first 6 games, they won by double digits. Just think about that. It was one of I think it was 8 teams in NFL history to win their first 6 games by double digits. They were one of 7 teams to start 13-0. I mean, 13-0. Just think about how hard that is. That was the further we get from that Super Bowl team, the more you realize just how good they were, how dominant they were, and it all flipped in one offseason. One last little note. This is going to sound a little like I'm self-aggrandizing, but the column we do every year where I survey the local media to get their picks, prognostications for the season. Well, we formally now.
Oh God, now I know where you're going with this now.
Yeah, we formally put it in print now. But back then, Brian Alley Walsh, my colleague at the Picayune at the time, he would do it informally. He would go around, just get everybody's picks, and we never printed it, but it was kind of trash talk among the media, in the media corps that year. I picked the Saints to be 12-4, and I was ridiculed by my colleagues at that time because I was labeled a homer, But I sensed that they'd fixed what they'd. I guess I jumped on board early. I knew Greg Williams from covering him with the Titans, so I knew he was a really good defensive coordinator. And to this day, everyone still remembers Jim Henderson. I think it was about week 6 or 7 that year on his commentary at WWL TV said, "I think this team can win the Super Bowl." And of course, Jim was hailed as this genius and everything. I was like,
but
"Look,
no love for Jeff Duncan.
I did it in training camp before they ever even played a game."
No love
12-4.
All right, Jeff. Well, congratulations on that 15-year-old prediction that came true.
Still a little bitter about it.
But speaking of the offseason, it does show, Rod, the Saints were known at that time for their offense. I mean, they had all these playmakers. Breeze was a legitimate star by this time. When it came down to brass tacks in the playoffs, their defense beat up Brett Favre in the NFC Championship game, sacked him how many times, Jeff? Do you know off the top of your head? 8 times, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's it. 8.
And then in the Super Bowl, they hold Peyton Manning's Colts to, I think, 7 points in the second half, get the Tracy Porter interception, end the Super Bowl on a defensive play. It just speaks to the change that they were able to enact on that side of the ball.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what this team needed. I mean, obviously, the offense was Drew Brees led, and you knew they were going to be able to score points. But once you put that combination together, you knew this team could be really, really good, which is kind of where we are now. I mean, the defense is pretty solid. You just need the offense to kind of catch up. So it's just a matter of getting both sides to be – both sides don't have to be great. I just think both sides have to be really, really good. And I think the Saints are in a position where if this offense gets going under Clint Kubiak, maybe that's the formula they need.
Could be. All right, moving on to number 2 in our ranking of past 25 years off seasons. And this, I believe, was your first off season covering the team, Jeff, the year 2000. And it was significant for several reasons. Number 1, first and foremost, I think, because they brought on Mickey Loomis.
Right. Mickey Loomis was the right-hand man of Randy Mueller, who was the general manager they brought in from Seattle, and he hired Jim Haslett. And they kind of brought, I think, a whole new life to the team. The team had been 3-13 the year before under Mike Ditka.
It's right after Ditka, yeah.
Yeah, really kind of a clown show. I hate to say it that way, but, I mean, it was a joke. And the first thing they did was fix quarterback. They got Jeff Blake, who was an established veteran. To me, very similar to getting Derek Carr. A guy that had won at a high level, was established, had skins on the wall. And then they made the trade in training camp to get Aaron Brooks. No one really knew who Aaron Brooks was, but suddenly you had Jake Delhomme, Aaron Brooks, and Jeff Blake in the quarterback room. They fixed the quarterback position overnight. And then the subtle thing they did was signing Norman Hand, who I didn't know much about, big run stuffer in free agency. and they didn't have a first-round pick that year. They drafted Darren Howard, a defensive end out of Kansas State, and plugged those two guys in alongside Leroy Glover, the three technique, and Joe Johnson, who was a Pro Bowl defensive end. And all of a sudden, they're front four, and they signed Charlie Clemens, a linebacker, another kind of unheralded free agent, and he became kind of their pass rush specialist in passing situations, and they just took the lead by storm. To this day, they've never had a pass rush like that. 66 sacks. I don't know if that club record will ever be broken. They had three guys that had double-digit sacks. Now they're lucky to get one. Leroy Glover had 17, I think, and a half sacks as a defensive tackle. Insane numbers,
man.
And he just
that's Aaron Donald.
Turned the team around 3-13 to 10-6. Won the division, beat the Rams in the playoffs, first playoff win, and obviously the other guy they got in free agency was a Mississippi native, Joe Horn, who played at Itawamba Junior College, and Joe Horn was like the third receiver for the Chiefs. And it was this really good strategy to go out and get a guy and plugged him in to the X spot in the West Coast system. And Joe Horn went to, I think, 4 or 5 Pro Bowls.
Also the author of one of the great touchdown celebrations in NFL history. Get the phone out of the
cell phone
extra point stanchion. Get Horn on the horn. This was before my time. I was in high school, but I do remember actually Ditka specifically trading up for Ricky Williams was that the 99 draft? And
I think it was.
Thinking even at that age, man, that seems like a crazy thing to do. And it obviously turned out to be crazy. And Rod, I know that was before your time in New Orleans too, but like.
I had just seen Ricky Williams in the Cotton Bowl because they beat Mississippi State and he just ran over them. So I didn't think the move was as bad. And I wasn't here in New Orleans at the time, so I wasn't all invested into the team like that. But I really thought Ricky Williams was going to be like the greatest running back ever because I had just seen him just – I mean, he ran for like 200 yards in the Cotton Bowl that year. I don't know if it was 200, but close to that. I mean, he was just a man among boys almost. And so I thought Ricky Williams was going to really.
And Ricky Williams had a good career. Like, but as a number 2 pick and giving up what they gave up for him. But it's I guess where I'm going is the organization it needed a reset button in the worst way. It's like a Madden franchise that has gone so far gone that you just say, I'm going to start over with a new team. And it's obviously not easy to do that in real life, but the Saints were able to do it.
Yeah, and it sort of changed the trajectory before, obviously before Sean got here. But, yeah, they needed to do something. And I don't know if the team right now is at that point yet, but, I mean, there's some fans who think that it's time for a reset now. And I think they're right there where people think, okay, we're almost there. And people are kind of just counting on this team, turn the corner because they feel like I guess the past 2 or 3 years, they felt like they've been right there.
Well, yeah.
Which is why.
Oh,
go ahead.
Look, I think this. I mean, so going back to that 2000 team, because of that trade, where it really hurt the team was they didn't have draft picks to kind of build the depth on the roster. Randy Mueller had to supplement because they lost all these draft picks. They had to go to free agency to try and fill in. Like he said, their special teams were terrible because usually your 6th, 7th round guys are, filling in your special teams. So they had to use free agency to do that. What I think is interesting now where the Saints are at, they don't have a ton of draft capital. So I do think we've talked in a lot of speculation about would they trade a Marshon Lattimore, would they trade Alvin Kamara. I think that's one way they can acquire some draft capital is get maybe some draft assets. Now, they have to do that before the draft, obviously. But there is, I think, a strategic reason. A lot of fans would say, why would you move on from Marshon Lattimore? He's a Pro Bowl cornerback, or Alvin Kamara, maybe the most popular player on the team. Well, you're better to do that before they drop off, and these guys are getting up there, and they still have value. So they could be attractive in a trade to another team, whereas the Saints might be kind of transitioning away from this older roster and trying to transition to the future.
Well, and I think that's why we're talking about this, and the offseason really starts in earnest with the new league year on March the 13th, so a couple weeks away. 2 weeks exactly, I think. They've got to really thread the needle this year. I mean, you got an aging roster. You don't have a lot of draft capital. You had a team that feasted on takeaways last year, which historically, like statistically, that thing will regress on you, right? So you can't count on that. The schedule gets more difficult. I mean, they really need to nail the offseason. And so that brings us to our number one offseason of the last 25 years. And I think anybody paying attention probably knows what it is. It's 2006, right after Katrina. You talk about a team that maybe, a franchise that could have moved, could have essentially died in New Orleans, and instead they got the nucleus that led them to a Super Bowl just 3 years later.
And what they did that offseason that was so impressive was they kind of hit on every avenue that you have to build a roster, to build a coaching staff. They hired Sean Payton, who brought in the staff that was, so well respected. You go out in free agency, get Drew Brees. When does a Drew Brees ever become available at quarterback in free agency? It just doesn't really ever happen. They used trades. If you remember, they traded and got Scott Shanley and Hollis Thomas. These guys were not superstars, but they were starting caliber veterans that kind of really filled holes on the roster. And then in the draft, they had probably the second best draft in the history of the franchise, arguably, getting Reggie Bush, Roman Harper, Jari Evans, who's going to be in the Hall of Fame, Marcus Colston, the leading receiver in the history of the franchise. So they hit home runs in every kind of way they had to kind of jumpstart their recovery.
We did 25 years. You could have gone back the entire 57-year history of this franchise, and you would have ranked that one number one.
Yeah, that's the year that we probably wouldn't even be sitting here doing a podcast about the Saints if it wasn't for that year. That just changed everything around this city and just raised the bar. And now everybody's just trying to get back to that level of what that 2006 offseason did for this team. And the Saints are hoping that, I think when you look at this offseason, I think, it goes back to the offensive coordinator. I think people are hoping that that's the fix. Obviously they want to bring in some more players. They want to hit on the draft, but I think they're really banking on, the offensive coordinator being able to fix the issues that they've had.
Yeah, it was our January 3rd podcast. I went back and listened to it. It was first podcast of the new year, and I said, will 2024 be better than 2023 for the Saints? And I can't remember exactly who was here, but all four of us who were here to a man said, no, there's no way that they can have a better year in 2024 than 2023. Roster's older, schedule's more difficult. The offense has all these uncertainties. I'm a little more optimistic now than I was then, I think. Clint Kubiak changes your mind a little bit. They've got some salary cap relief. Maybe it's just the optimism of an offseason, but it feels like it's at least possible.
Yeah, I'm sure I was one of the ones who thought it wasn't possible. Because at the time, they hadn't fired Pete Carmichael.
They had not. No, it was before they even played the Falcons.
Yeah. So I think you're a little bit more optimistic, but, everybody's optimistic this time of the year, I think, in a way. So I'm not sure.
All right, so Jeff, you got to get out of here, but that's it. That's your ranking. People can read your full column on NOLA.com. I put the link in the description of this episode, and I think just a really good exercise to remind people that this what they do here in March and April is very important for September and October.
And look, I think the common denominator with all those successful ones all seasons they had in the past was they were aggressive, they were bold, they had a strategy and a plan. And they went out and executed. Now, what I'm curious to see is, are they going to be that way this year? Like I said last time we did the pod, it sounded to me like after the season, they felt like they needed to really take a really hard look at this roster, this coaching staff, and make some tough decisions. They did with the coaching staff. Now, are they going to do the same thing with the roster? I know they're hamstrung a little bit by the cap, but I do think, they've held their cards close to the vest the last few weeks, as they like to do. It's going to be interesting to see if they're as bold and aggressive as they've been when Sean Payton was here under Dennis Allen.
We will follow it every step of the way on NOLA.com and on the Saints on NOLA.com YouTube channel. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button for us. That's our show for today. We'll be back next week. Have Luke and Matt back in to talk about what they saw in Indianapolis, what they learned from the Combine, and kind of get ready for free agency season, which, as we said, starts here in a couple of weeks. So for Rod Walker and Jeff Duncan, I'm Zach Ewing. Norman Bell is our producer, and we will see you next time on the Saints Insider Podcast.